Welcome back in studio. I have with me John Punchon of the SPCA, but you're not in that particular role today, are you?
Right. Nope, not today.
Okay, so why don't we start basically with what you are doing for the month of October. John, you're a crazy person. You're trying to scare yourself to death every night before you go to bed, basically.
Well, I don't know necessarily scaring myself, but I am a huge cinemaphile. So I love classic cinema, all types of cinema, but I'm also a huge fan of horror and the horror genre. So I decided to challenge myself to do 31 days of horror movies and select 32, because I'll do 2 on Halloween night, but try and do from the genre from the early days to current horror, and just sort of experience them. Most of them I've seen before, but it was just a great opportunity for me. I just thought to sit myself down and get in that Halloween spirit.
Okay, now, speaking as someone who's not really into horror movies, not that I don't like any horror movies, but I don't deal with being scared easily. Why do this to yourself? What is it about horror that's so attractive to you?
You know, it's funny, I was very much the same growing up. I was terrified of movies like Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street. All of those things absolutely terrified me. So it was only until actually the early 2000s when I was in college where I was introduced to horror films, and they appealed to me in a lot of the time, honestly, it's more of a social commentary. A great horror film has a lot of underlying themes about in a more dramatic fashion, but ultimately is, deep down there's a commentary about what our society is, or what it's telling us about at that time of what was sort of socially conscious, and some of the films we'll discuss will certainly talk a little bit about some of those social impacts, for sure. And
we're going to actually just go right to that. So the very first film on this list, I think, touches on what you were just speaking of.
Yeah, I mean, the first film, the earliest one that I have is, of course, 1931, Frankenstein, which is based on Mary Shelley's novel. Very different take on it, of course. This was Universal, had initially done Dracula. They followed it up with Frankenstein, and kind of moved their way through that genre with The Wolf Man and Creature from the Black Lagoon, and became sort of the first sort of movie franchise. But what's great about Frankenstein, it's Boris Karloff who plays Frankenstein, Frankenstein's monster.
And yeah, don't get those.
Don't get them mixed up. You know, it's obviously got that overacting because we're just sort of getting used to sound in film. So there is still a little bit of that silent film type acting to it. But Boris Karloff does a very sympathetic job of this monster, and there's some great scenes, particularly where he interacts with the child. And what's interesting about that is the child really doesn't see him as the monster. You know, society, the community's all terrified by this monster, including Frankenstein, who actually makes the monster. But yet there's that touching moment with the child, and perfectly innocent, where the child is throwing flowers into the water, and the monster is doing it as well, and then he decides to interact with the girl in a certain way that leads to the ending. And one of my favorite scenes, of course, is with the windmill at the end there too, which is memorable too.
Yeah, well, that's a great place, obviously, to start. We'll have more with John in the next hour as we explore some other of his favorite and classic horror films over the course of October. Back in studio with John Punchon of the SPCA, but our resident horror movie expert, and going through 31 or 32 films? Remind me again.
31, but ideally we'll try and sneak in 2 on Halloween night.
Right. Yeah. So we already covered Frankenstein, 1931.
Yep.
Okay, we'll go next. We have The Uninvited, and that's 1930 or 1940?
1943.
Okay.
And that's actually based on a book by Dorothy McCardle. That one is more of your traditional ghost story type haunted house. The first one in the horror genre to take a more serious look at things, as opposed to sort of this joking haunted house with sort of a almost comedic storytelling. Ray Milland is in it, who later won an Oscar for Lost Weekend, and a great kind of humorous performance. So there's some humor in there and some generally very creepy moments as well, but definitely one of my favorites.
Yeah. Next on his list is an all-time classic, not just for horror, but for film in general, Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho 1960.
Here we have a quiet little motel.
I don't want to give spoilers away, even though the spoiler is a classic one, but it really broke a lot of movie tropes.
Yes, absolutely. And the great thing with Alfred Hitchcock, he's a master of the suspense for a reason. There's so many great shots to that movie, particularly the shower scene. How it's shot is a very intense piece of cinema, but it's shot in a way that she's in a shower, but there's no gratuitous violence, there's no nudity, but it's shot in such a way that it frightens you. So much so that the actress, Janet Leigh, later in life would never take a shower again. She always just took a bath after that because it stuck with her. And definitely has a very memorable ending that still is shocking today.
Yeah, and definitely an interesting behind-the-scenes story if you want to look up any more information on Psycho. That in itself is some entertainment. Now we're going to jump ahead to another lesser-known film, Carnival of Souls.
Yes, this is actually Herrick Harvey is the director, and he only made one film. This movie is really interesting. It's a ghost story. It's a very art house feel to it. There's some moments where there's no soundtrack, no audio for long periods of time, and there's just a generally very creepy feel about it. It's one that's worth checking out. It's not one that you're going to see find very easily, but definitely some memorable scenes in that one too.
Awesome. And another memorable film to finish the list, again, I think an all-time classic, George Romero's Night of the Living Dead. So 1968, yes. This film is one of the first zombie films I saw, so it definitely freaked me out. And it also was significant for having people of color in significant roles.
Absolutely. That really for me was sort of the springboard into the horror genre. It's definitely one of my all-time favorites. And you're right, the piece with regards to the social commentary is very prevalent there, with a man of color being the last character in the movie, and really is the main character, the voice, and really the leader of the group, which at that time was relatively unheard of. It wasn't seen. What's interesting to note as well with the zombie genre, prior to that, zombie films were more like a Haitian trance that they were put in. This is the first one where they are flesh-eating, slow shuffling zombies, and that changed the genre, and that's how zombies are now seen. And we see that in TV shows like The Walking Dead, and that was all George Romero that changed that.
Yeah, and ultimately, maybe the most lasting impact of any horror film over that span, certainly in terms of special effects as well, practical and computer graphic. Well, we are out of time for this week, but we have plenty of more on the docket, as you said, more than 30 films planned for this month. So
lots of watching.
Yeah, we'll be back with more later on this month here on Primetime Local News.